Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another TV show episode review from the classic 90s Goosebumps TV show we all know and love. And in today's episode, we're pulling an episode from season 3, and it's the two-parter, The Perfect School. Now, off the bat, in case you didn't know, The Perfect School is a short story from the Tales That Give You Goosebumps series, and it's the only Tales That Give You Goosebumps short story to receive a two-parter in the TV show. Going along with that, this episode was originally a one-parter. So it was a single-length episode that ran, I think, 21 to 22 minutes. And the producers loved this episode so much, they went back and shot additional scenes to make this a two-parter. And boy, oh boy, some of the stuff this episode does is fantastic. The music, the practical effects, some of the editing choices with like inserting timestamps on certain scenes. Some of the acting is very memorable. The directing, the set, all of it was really fun. Scott Peters, who did the teleplay for this episode, did a fantastic job inserting some creativity and some changes from the source material to really give this episode its own identity. And Ron Oliver really delivered something special here. This is definitely one of Ron Oliver's best episodes in the show. It's not my personal favorite. I don't think it's quite showing his genius. But this one's very solid, and this one's pretty much highly regarded in the community, especially the TV show community, as being one of the best episodes. I've even heard some people say that this is the episode that goes toe-in-toe against the original Haunted Mass to be the best episode. Now, do I agree with that? Not really. I think I do have one little thing about this episode that gets to me, but I'll get into that near the end of the video. But yeah, this is a great episode. Stars Sean Roberts, who you might know from the Resident Evil movies. He plays Wesker. He plays the main character, Brian O'Connor. Not the same Brian O'Connor from Fast and Furious, or the Fast and Furious franchise, who Paul Walker played. But this is a memorable episode, for better, more than worse, and it is just an iconic one. And I know some people are going to probably watch this video and be upset with what I rated near the end, but we'll get into that near the end of the video. Off the bat, do I recommend this episode? Yes. If you have not watched The Perfect School, you need to go watch this episode. This one is a really good one. Really, really solid episode. Yes, you might know I have this thing sealed in the Spooky Tales for Kids. You might have saw this a long time ago when I did Welcome to Dead House and The Werewolf of Fever Swamp. This is the third one I know to exist. It comes with a trick-or-treat bag, and this is still sealed in the box. So I'll be using this for reference in the video. So let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So, if you're familiar with the short story, this episode, like I said, they went back and shot additional scenes to add to the episode, and a lot of this stuff really comes out in part 1 that I think they went back and added. So this episode kicks off with a really creepy scene. It's a thundery night in this house, and this little boy's in his room in the dark, and he's by himself, and he hears something going on in the house, and he's getting creeped out, and somebody may or may not be inside of his house calling his name. I think his name is Riley O'Connor, and calling his name, and he's getting freaked out. Then you cut to a scene where the parents, who have left for about an hour to go out to dinner, are talking about how leaving Brian O'Connor, who's the main character, and the little kid who's in the room, Riley O'Connor, home for an hour shouldn't be a bad idea. So they get in the car and they head home, and it turns out there's a mass intruder shutting off the power, speaking in the vents, creeping this kid out, and then it cuts to a scene where he opens the door and the kid screams bloody murder. It's pretty iconic. And once the pan out comes back, it's revealed that the intruder stopped by Riley's parents, and the mask is pulled off, and it's revealed to be Brian, the main character. Then it cuts to him waiting outside his house, presumably waiting for a bus. He's holding a pamphlet that says The Perfect School. And the parents have basically had enough of Brian for pulling all these pranks on his brother. They want him to be better, and they think sending him off to the perfect school would be good for him. And Brian's essentially pleading for his parents to let him stay, and this time they're just not having it. So the bus arrives, and Brian hops on and bids his family farewell. While on the bus, he notices a kid with glasses. His name is Joe, and he finds out his name later on. But he doesn't want to sit next to Joe because Joe looks like he's the outcast of the group. He kind of looks out of place. He looks more like a goody two-shoes, and it seems kind of weird that he's on this bus full of misfit kids. But then he sees this cool kid with sunglasses, and he goes sits next to him, and he reveals himself to be named CJ. And CJ essentially gives Brian the rundown about this school and how this school is supposed to shape kids up, but all they got to do is just hang low and they'll be out in no time. And Brian's not enthused to go there, and when they arrive at the school, they all get out of the bus, and you see this scene of this headmaster, and whoever plays this headmaster guy, he's really fun. So the headmaster guy is really great, and he's watching these kids come, and he's like looking through a window, overlooking where the bus terminal is, and he comes down and greets everyone. And then the kids coming off the bus, it's Joe, CJ, and Brian. They're looking at this one kid getting sent home with his parents, and they're like, that kid doesn't look normal. What did they do to these kids at this school? And then it cuts to the headmaster saying, welcome to the perfect school. And they then cut to a line where they're pretty much giving up all their personal items they have on them. They have to give up their watches, their wallets, any technology, cell phones, whatever. They have to give it up. And while in line, Brian makes this comment to this kid in the back, and I think the kid's name is actually hinted to be Billy Brown or something. And he bumps into this kid named Billy and says that he missed a spot while mopping, and Billy has this outburst, and the headmaster has him sent away, and Billy kind of disappears. And all the kids are kind of shaken up, and they're told to go to their rooms for the night because they have a long day ahead of them the next day. So it cuts to Brian for about a minute, tossing and turning in his bed at night, can't sleep, and he's not thrilled to be there because the bed's kind of small and he doesn't really like being there. So it cuts to like 6 a.m. the next morning, and the boys are eating breakfast. They're kind of talking, and they said, hey, have you seen that Brian kid? Have you seen that, his name's not Brian. Have you seen that Billy kid? And they're like, no. And Joe reaches for a bagel, and he gets yelled at for some reason, and nothing really became of that. And then it cuts to them going into the classroom for the first time. And while in this classroom, it's kind of like the book. This is where it gets more like the book, where Brian and CJ are kind of talking in the back of the class, and they're noticing that Joe is kind of a kiss-up, and CJ's starting to plant this seed in Brian's head that maybe Joe is not who they think he is, and maybe he's kind of a plant or something. And they look at this pamphlet of questions that they're being given in the classroom, and they're questions about, like, what's your shoe size? What do you remember getting for presents past few holidays? Stuff like that. Similar to the short story. They're like, these are really weird questions. And like I said, that suspicion with Joe is there as well. And that carries on into another scene, which Brian gets this idea. He's like, you know what? I want to escape. And Joe kind of urges him not to do it. And he tries to drop a hint to him that there could be a better time, but Brian doesn't listen, and he's like, I'm going to try to escape. And there's this whole big thing where Brian tries to escape the school. He's dressed, and he leaves the property through his window and climbs down, and then he tries to go up to the fence and leave through the fence. But when he does that, he triggers an alarm, and all these spotlights come around. The guardians, these teachers, these workers wearing blue overalls, like jumpsuits and stuff, they're called guardians, and they all storm the yard trying to see what's going on. And the headmaster thinks that somebody's trying to escape, and they go out, and the headmaster and the guardians go out to the yard, and Brian's kind of playing this stealth game, hiding around, trying to dodge getting caught by the guardians. And the headmaster gets his idea to go back inside of the school and do a head count, and there's this really suspenseful build. It's kind of, it's a textbook thing where two moments converge into a certain result. And let's just say Brian came out back in his room on time when his door gets open, and the headmaster's pretty much pinned him to be the person that tried to escape. And Brian's in his room and said that he took too long because he was getting dressed. So the next day comes, after that whole debacle went down, and CJ and Joe are around Brian, and Brian's kind of talking with CJ, and CJ's like, "It was you that tried to escape last night." He didn't really answer, but he's like, "Yeah, I'm still going to try to find a way to escape." And CJ's like, "You know why I think it didn't work? I think Joe ratted you out." And he kind of points at Joe, who's making friends with these guardians. And Brian gets this idea that maybe Joe is trying to ruin his escape. So once he hears that later that night, he kind of leaves his room to go kind of explore around a little bit. And he goes to Joe's room, and he tells Joe that if he gets caught or anything, he's going to blame Joe, and he's going to pin it on Joe for getting him in trouble. And Joe's like, "Just go to bed. It's not worth trying to escape. Let's try this again another time." So Brian's like, "Okay, whatever. I'm going to try to do this on my own." And he kind of scurries out the hall after he hears somebody hides in a room, and he continues down and finds the headmaster's office where there's a phone. And essentially he tries to call his mom on this phone, and then he's caught after his mom picks up, and the headmaster takes the phone from him and says, "No, Brian's okay. Everything is fine as it is. We're going to take care of him and make sure that he doesn't try this again." So Brian's escorted out, and there's a scene where he's put into his bed, and then a person with gloves break into the room, and they cover his mouth, and they have a syringe open, ready to go, and that's where part 1 ends. Now part 2 picks up from that, where after the recap a little bit, Brian is shown to be in a daze, being wheeled down the hall, and he's being sent to like this hospital room where they're doing all this work to him. And it seems like all of a dream when he wakes up, and CJ wakes him up. He goes, "Look, we got to be in class in like 5 minutes." And Brian just lays there. He's like, "Oh, that was weird." And then while in class, Brian says that something's wrong with the school, and he's trying to get to the bottom of it. And while CJ and him are talking, Joe asks to be excused because he's made friends with the Guardians to go get a drink of water, and the attention gets the attention of the Guardian, and then something happens like a distraction, which Brian is called to the headmaster's office to discuss, I guess, his punishment for what he tried to do the night before. And while he's there, he sees Joe sitting there in the waiting room in the headmaster's office too. And Joe drops a hint, because Joe's not in the short story, but Joe really gives Brian some help and says basically his strategy. He goes, "Look, I'm coming up with a plan to escape, and the reason why they stay off my back is because you have to go along to get along." And Brian kind of asks him what he means by that, and he says, "As long as you act good, people will believe you." And Brian's like, "Okay, that's a pretty good idea." So the headmaster comes out, and he says he's disappointed to see Joe there, but fully expects Brian to be there. And he tells Brian to wait there because he's going to handle Joe first. And Joe seems like he's just going to get a pat on the back because this is his first time getting in trouble. So Brian, while Joe is gone, he decides to escape and go do some more sleuthing. And he finds this room with a computer on it. And he looks at the computer, and he sees this layout room where he sees this thing called the nursery, and he starts hearing these. He keeps throughout these episodes, he keeps hearing these voices coming from like the floor, and he kind of wants to figure out where it's coming from, but unfortunately, he can't really find that area just yet in the story, because he hears somebody coming into the computer room because an alarm sounds that there was unauthorized computer usage. So he hides up in the vents and waits for the guy to leave after he calls and says it was just a malfunction, and he goes into the vent system, and he hops out, and he finds CJ at the top of the stairs, and he goes, "Hey, look, I'm gonna try to bust out tonight. I got an idea. I saw the blueprints of the school. I think I know a way out." And CJ's like, "Okay, cool." And he's like, "I need you to make a distraction for me." And CJ kicks a bucket of water down, and then these two boys get wet, and he's like, "He did it." And these two boys start fighting, and the Guardians get wrapped up in that. And then Brian makes his way down to the hall where he needs to be at, and he's hiding, um, kind of walking around. There's Guardians throughout the hallway. I think people are looking for him because he disappeared. The headmaster realized he didn't show up for his meeting, so they're looking for Brian. And he ends up hiding in this room by accident. Then he looks at the sign. It says the nursery. And this is where the episode gets really good. So he ends up in the nursery, and he's looking around, and he's starting to see these deja vu moments from his dream that he thought he had. And he's like, "I've been here before." And he's looking around, and he stumbles his way into this laboratory type of room with these like vat tanks with like water and stuff in it. At least that's how it appears. And they have these buttons, and he pushes one of these buttons, and I kid you not, in a kids show, and I think this is where people really love this episode. In a kids show, there's a jumbled mess of cells, like fetuses and stuff, mushed together that they probably made out of like baby dolls. But that is genuinely creepy, right? So like the short story has this connotation of robots, and this they're actually making genuine clones. And Brian from earlier, he's looking at the computer, and he kind of got a sense that they have this file on him where he's like 95% complete, and he doesn't know what that means. And he goes over to the tank, and I kid you not, this is also in this episode. He presses the next tank's button, and it's a clone of him with an umbilical cord attached to this thing. He's like this biological creature being made to be an exact replica of him. And the clone awakens. And he takes the umbilical cord, rips it out, and looks at him and grunts. It's so iconic. And Brian's like, "Oh crap, I gotta get out of here." And when he escapes the nursery, he runs into CJ, and he tries to tell CJ, he goes, "Look, man, they're making clones of us. We gotta get out of here. They're trying to replace us." And there's like this circular camera work, and CJ's like, "Okay, I know where to go. We gotta go to this area. We can escape through here." And CJ takes him down to this room. He puts in this passcode, and there's a big revelation, where there's a cell. Presumably, I'm not going to say if they're the real kids, or maybe there's a holding place for these clones. I'm not going to say what it is. You got to watch it for yourself. But Brian's like, "Oh crap!" And then there's a big plot twist with CJ that's very similar to the short story. And Brian tries to flee the clutches of CJ and whoever else is in that room. And when he gets out into the hallway, he's greeted by presumably either the real students or the clones. I'm not going to spoil it. And he tries to run, and then he encounters his clone. And then it fades a little bit, and then we get this ending. Now it appears that Brian's back home. Is it the real Brian? Is it the clone Brian? We don't know until the very ending, where there's this thing that happens to Brian's little brother, and there's kind of a nod saying that maybe, just maybe, the real Brian's out there, and maybe, just maybe, there could be something good coming for him. It's one of those Goosebumps episodes that have a more positive spin ending. And that's where I'll leave it. I don't want to spoil what it is. I'll just keep it vague like that. So that's essentially the perfect school episode. So this episode was great. Off the bat, Ron Oliver did a great job with this episode. The editing team behind this as well. The music score. Everything just blended very well. And that goes also to Sean Roberts putting one of the best leading performances in the show. He did a great job as Brian. All the actors kind of brought it. The only actor that really just didn't bring it all that much was CJ, the actor who played him. But everybody else was fantastic. It all blends together with Scott Peters' writing, and it just comes off like it's so close to being a masterpiece. It's so close. It's a definitely one of the most memorable from the TV show for sure. And this episode kind of proves that this should have been a full book. I think The Perfect School would have been a great book somewhere in the 40s of Goosebumps. Take your pick on which book you want to replace. The Perfect School would have been a great story to have in the original 62. And I think the two-parter kind of proves that. I think the story has more legs than people usually give it credit for, at least for the short story. Some of the changes that Scott Peters put in this episode are genuinely shocking. Like the fetus stuff, the clone with the umbilical cord, that is insane. The fact that there's a syringe even shown in this episode is insane. I mean, this episode really pushes the envelope. If we're talking about Ultimate Goosebumps and like Danny Angel and Billy Brown's vision of Ultimate Goosebumps kind of pushing the envelope a little bit, this is definitely one to do that. Especially considering some of the stuff in the show. I've seen some pretty intense body horror in like Haunted Mass 2, but some of the stuff in this is genuinely shocking. And it's all in good fun. It adds a lot to this episode. And this episode, in its own right, the story itself, there's this really good tense. Part 1 is building this tension so well. That cliffhanger ending with the syringe, all the way up there. Part 1 is just excellent. And then Part 2 with that finale is so iconic. It's so creepy and jarring. And it's pure fun. It's pure fun at the heart of it. And like I said, it has that uplifting, it has that more upbeat kind of end that most episodes just don't have. And it feels memorable for a lot of the right reasons. I really have nothing negative to say. A lot of this episode is just, it checks off every single box I look for. But, I'm sorry, stans of this episode, I do have a negative with this. And I think that for this episode's biggest sin that it has is that it just drags. And part of that, I think, is from it originally being a single-length episode, and they stretched out the plot to make it a two-parter. I'm not objecting to making this story longer. I definitely think that this is one that warrants a longer episode. But the old show lived and died by that 22-minute time crunch, and I feel like they had to add so many filler scenes, especially in part 2. There's even some mild ones in part 1, like Brian twisting and turning in his room, and then the whole breakfast scene where Joe takes a bagel. That's filler scenes. But then part 2 is noticeably where a lot of the filler happens. In part 2, after like the first 2 minutes, it drags for like another 8 minutes, 9 minutes. It just drags longer than it needs to. And I'm not going to lie, part 2, it takes a little bit to get going. It just feels like it just meanders a little bit. It stumbles, getting to the point, getting to the finale. I feel like we had this great build-up, and then part 2 just kind of stalls it out and kind of fizzles it for a little bit. And I'm not going to lie, that's what really prevents me from giving this a 5 out of 5. It's just, I don't know how else to put it. It just drags in some areas where it shouldn't drag. This is a textbook episode, and I've said this about a couple, but this is one that would have definitely benefited from like a as much time needed format. This would have been a perfect 30 to 35 minute episode, probably more perfectly at 35 minutes. You can shave off 7 minutes of this episode, 7 to 8 minutes, and be fine. Because all that stuff is filler. If you cut that out, this episode, I think, would be truly the contender to be the best episode. At least one of them. But like I said, it just drags. And I know some people really love this episode. I'm not trying to crap on your favorite episode out there if you love this episode. I do love a lot about this episode. I love the majority of this. It just doesn't keep my interest as some of my other personal faves, and I kind of think that it slightly overstays its welcome with its length. But other than that, this is a great episode. So, from a 0 to 5 star basis, where I decided to rate this episode, like I said, for how this episode kind of drags in some parts of the episode to kind of stretch the length out when they changed it from a single-length episode to a two-parter, I only deducted 0.4 off, and I gave this episode a 4.6 out of 5. That's still an A for me. This is a great episode. I highly recommend you watch this if you haven't. And trust me, you're missing out if you don't try this. So yeah, that's my thoughts on The Perfect School, the episode. Let me know down in the comment section if you have watched this before. Do you love this, or do you hate this? I'm dying to know, and I'll see you next time.